Time to talk Auramite, Adamantium, and great big toughness values and armor saves, with a review of Index Adeptus Custodes in Warhammer 40K 10th edition. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Custodes, and in this video I thought we'd take a full look through their new and updated rules for 40K 10th with a new downloadable index from Games Workshop. In the video we'll talk through their index, their new army rule and the shield host detachments, a few datasheet changes, and everything that's from the standard plastic range of Adeptus Custodes. Broadly speaking, I don't think they've done too badly out of this index. I feel like they maybe are a little bit more dedicated to being a fairly close combat army now, and have had a bit of a tone down of their one good ranged weapon profile. But at least they do the combat all rather well with their martial katars, and I quite like the different unit special rules that they have to better differentiate the different flavours of Infantry Golden Boy, whether it's Custodians, Wardens, or Alarus. Here's a quick breakdown of the contents of Index of Adeptus Custodes. The Martial Katar is the faction rule, basically amping them up in melee in 3 different ways, your choice at the start of the fight phase, all very handy and flexible. Their shield host is the launch detachment. This is going to be the way that you play them, at least until they get their codex, when they'll have more options. This detachment gives you the Aegis of the Emperor special rule for a 4+ save against mortal wounds, 6 stratagems and 4 enhancements. Maybe feels like more or less generic Custodes out of the previous decks, perhaps a bit of an Emperor's Chosen themed battle host. Then there's Datasheets, quite a slim codex this one, only 17 of them out of the main Games Workshop offering. This one's just for the plastic miniatures for the army line. The Forge World ones will apparently follow in their own index, apparently a bit after 10th edition launch according to what Games Workshop said before. Obviously Forge World units are really quite a big deal for Custodes armies. Their army does feel a bit less well-rounded without them, lacking options for things like ranged battle tanks, and a few other interesting choices like ranged Custodian Guard and Jump Infantry. At time of recording, we're also still missing the points cost for these guys. These should be out on Friday, but we can certainly piece together how the army is going to be functioning in 10th and the way that the units work together. I'll aim to follow this up with a bit of a review of the units when we have the points costs. It will be interesting to see how they stack up in practice. Getting into the core of the rules, and first up we have the army rule called Martial Katar. This is the one that you'll get regardless of detachment when you have choices, and it replaces the 9th edition rule of the same name that was a bit convoluted where you had to pick 3 katars out of 6 and then cycle through either 1 or 2 of the different stances in the order that you'd specified at the start of the battle. It really did feel kind of unnecessarily complicated in my opinion. I feel like at least a few people will be happy to see that it's far simpler, just nice, easy and effective, and you directly get a good result from it. The Martial Katar is now a purely melee buff or debuff to your Custodes. It doesn't help you with range at all, and perhaps really cements them as a dedicated combat faction, as opposed to something that's going to be lighting the enemy up with their Forge World shooting weapons. You get to choose one of these 3 buffs at the start of the fight phase, and that makes it really quite flexible. You can literally see which units that you've got made it into combat, and then which of these special rules will benefit them the most. You also get to choose this in both yours and your opponent's fight phase as well, so it's quite good and you can flex one turn to the other. First up there's the Captaris stance for a -1 to hit. This one's really quite nice in the opponent's charge phase, I think, when they're likely to be hitting you first. Often it might make more sense to have more of your Custodians have the best chance to survive the enemy attacks, as well as just having more of them on the board for later, you'll also be able to slap back with them, so it'll actually indirectly increase your damage as well. Otherwise, beyond that, you get the choice of 2 different damage boosts. Sustained hits 1 for a flat damage increase, usually an extra 20% for 2+ to hit Custodes. Maybe not crazily enormous, but will stack up every time you roll a 6 and get an additional hit on the enemy. Otherwise, if you're trying to punch up against some tough targets, then lethal hits will be the way to go. This is the one where you auto wound on 6s to hit, so it's basically superior to sustained hits if you're wounding on a 5+ or worse. Against tough targets that's far more meaningful, basically a plus 40% damage boost against those targets. They're pretty much equivalent if you're wounding on a 4+, and sustained is usually better if you're wounding on a 3+. Overall, I do think it's a very solid faction rule indeed. Extra durability when your opponent's hitting you in their turn, and then extra damage when you're charging them and striking first in yours. As with before, it is worth noting that it's just the Custodes that get this themselves, the Sisters of Silence don't. Moving on, we come to the rules for their shield host. This is the Custodes launch detachment, and their main faction rule is called Aegis of the Emperor. This one's still a bit of a defense against unnatural attacks. It gives you a 4+ feel no pain ability against mortal wounds, but interestingly enough not against psychic attacks, so weirdly it's going to be kind of good against things like vehicle explosions or the grenade stratagem, but might not actually help you out all that much against certain powerful psychic attacks, and in the lore it is kind of supposed to be against supernatural attacks. A 4+ feel no pain against mortal wounds definitely is helpful for Custodes. They're generally a rule that isn't too hard to access for various armies throughout the game, and they are one of the best ways to deal damage to Custodes if you didn't have this, directly bypassing the toughness save and invul save that Custodes get. As mentioned, this one is basically the rule that the Emperor's Chosen got last time round. They also had a single hit reroll built in, but that seems to have gone. And the 4+ invulnerable save that I think was also part of this rule, that's just farmed out to the individual datasheets now. You don't have to have it as a faction rule, as all the infantry just get it full stop. I guess it implies that you wouldn't get a save against mortal wounds if you're in other detachments, though I guess as well as whatever other rule they get, you could also have one that gives them a 6+ feel no pain type save as well, so they could still do that when the Custodes get more options. Overall handy enough, but nowhere near as powerful as Martial Qatar. It's just not relevant against a fair few armies or units attacking you. These first two appear to be usable by the Sisters of Silence as well, the rest of them are only locked to the Custodians themselves. Slayers of Nightmares makes a return. This one's just a nice simple 1 command point for +1 to wound monsters and vehicles in the fight phase. Between this and the lethal hits option, you've got really quite a serious boost against monsters. Between the two rules you get a +73% to your damage output. I think it is kind of equivocal with the sustained hits though, due to skipping out on the wound roll with the lethal ones. Either way though, this looks very dangerous on just about any Custodes unit. Pretty much without exception they all hit a whole bunch of attacks at strength 7 or so, and multi-damage and OK AP. If you are fighting something tough to take down, this is almost certainly going to equate to a decent amount of extra damage. For 1 CP we've got Avenge the Fallen. This is on one of your units that has taken casualties previously in the game. If they've lost 1 casualty, you get +1 attack. If the unit's below half strength, you get +2 attacks. I feel like this one's going to be a lot more niche than most of them. Realistically, even if you say lost 1 casualty out of a 5-man squad, that's only going to equate to an extra 4 attacks, which isn't nothing, but it also isn't enormous. A lot of the time it just won't be an option whether or not you want to use it, as your squad won't have got depleted yet. I think most of the time it's going to be most useful on something like a 10-man Custodian Guard squad if you wound up fielding one of those monster squads. Just theoretically, I suppose that could be 9 extra attacks on a massive unit, though to be honest, once you get that many attacks, you're probably already killing what you've got anyway, just because you've got a mad amount of melee in the unit already. I'd argue that maybe this one is one of the weakest out of the stratagems that they've got, though still usable. Next, for 2 command points, we've got Unwavering Sentinels, which is a pretty nasty one for your opponent charging you. This one and the rest in the section are locked to just the Adeptus Custodes. There's a bit of text excluding Anathema Psychana units. This one's really quite a powerful one, 2 command points, and it basically gives a Custodian unit the fight's first rule provided they're in range of an objective marker. Generally you'd want to use this in your opponent's turn when they've just charged you with something big and scary, but perhaps something big and scary that you can potentially kill before it kills you. If the game fights first, they'll even fight before a charging unit, provided you select this unit to fight first, and it means that your opponent can never really safely charge a Custodian unit on an objective, provided you've got these 2 CP here. This really could be absolutely massive. If you've got a big Custodes unit, there's a lot of enemy units that just won't be able to tank that kind of damage before dealing their own. Could make one of your units theoretically unchargeable, or at least guarantee your opponent has to charge 2 different things, except that they might well lose one of them. Looks very good, and perhaps a big incentive to try and keep your Custodes towing onto objectives, though that's kind of a big deal for the mission anyway. Next up for 2 command points, there's Arcane Genetic Alchemy. 2 command points for this for a -1 damage on your Custodes unit. This one's infantry only, so you can't use it on the bikes. 2 CP is definitely expensive, but if you're saving the lives of Custodians it could well be worth it. It's generally going to be most powerful on damage 2 or damage 3 things. Besides damage 3 against Terminators, if you use it on either of those, you should be decently reducing the opponent's efficiency. Perhaps the dream is turning damage 3 attacks down into damage 2, so they don't insta-kill a Custodian with each hit that lands. Currently it's one of the rules that reduces damage 1 down to damage 0, and there's nothing that prevents that. I strongly suspect that that's going to get an FAQ though. I wouldn't expect this to be able to just entirely negate damage 1 shooting. Still though, definitely helpful to have in the box of tricks. Could be interesting for a shield captain unit which can use stratagems for free. Next, for 1 command point, we've got Sworn Guardians. Again, this one is an objective one, and this one is kind of a utility one. Basically, I'd say that this one's best used if you've got an objective marker and you want to move off it. You trigger it in the movement phase, it doesn't say when, so I guess you could do it before your squad moves away, and that objective will continue to remain under your control until the opponent takes it at the start or end of any turn. I guess theoretically could be helpful if you're worried that your squad might take Battle Shock as well, but I feel like that's probably not worth preemptively spending the command point on it, probably just to save that for insane bravery should you need it. I think with the limited amount of units Custodians have though, this could be quite handy late game. Perhaps you've got one model that's holding an objective that's kind of safe anyway. If you spend the CP, then they could go off and take the fight to the enemy once more, knowing that the objective is safe. Finally, for one command point, we've got Vigil Unending. Again, I'd say that this one's one of the easiest and most direct buffs. Revive a slain Custodian infantry in the command phase. You can't use it for character models for obvious reasons, but you can use it on very powerful infantry models. It's going to be pretty massive each time you bring back a 4-wound Terminator with this. This one's really excellent value, and I wouldn't be too surprised if it's just used repeatedly throughout the game, perhaps particularly for units with a Custodian captain in them, who could use this stratagem for 0 CP. I think it's just going to be a great conversion of command points into points of units on the board. It's really going to punish your opponent for leaving any squads injured but alive, and of course you can do some big shenanigans with it as well. Deploy the models at the front of your units to shorten charges later in the turn, put more objective control points on objectives just before you score them, or potentially have a new Custodian join the fight in a melee combat that might well swing the balance in a tight combat and change it from a loss to a win. I think this one's going to be used an awful lot, probably one of the best and most reliable out of the stratagems. Overall though, I do think that it's a very strong stratagem pool. Slayer of Nightmares will help out against tanks and monsters. Unwavering Sentinels is very spooky for opponents trying to charge you. Arcane Genetic Alchemy is decent durability boost, if a little bit on the expensive side. And Vigil Unending for respawning Custodians looks like a bit of a nightmare for your opponent once more. That one's just got so much value, and I'd probably aim to be using it every turn if there's units that you can target. Finally, for the Shield Host, we've got 4 different enhancements for your non-named characters: Veiled Blade, Ceaseless Hunter, Unstoppable Destroyer, and Inspirational Exemplar. The Veiled Blade seems to be your damage buff weapon. This one gives you +2 attacks for your melee weapon base. If you do use it on a standard shield captain, it will go from 7 attacks to 9 attacks, around about a 30% damage increase there. I guess in theory it could be a bit more meaningful for characters that have got fewer but better attacks. Could be quite nice on the Dawn Eagle captain with the Interceptor Lance, or the Blade Champion on his low attack profile with Strength 6 and Damage 3. In any case, solid enough little combat boost. I think this could be quite popular if it's cheap enough, and also it's got a very nice once per game objective boost. In a single command phase you can choose to boost your objective control from 2 to 6 for a turn. A lot of the time won't be relevant, but really quite nice that you can flex into it any time that it would be relevant, and it basically swings a point from your control to your opponent's. I guess you just need to remember it when the time comes. Ceaseless Hunter allows you to fall back, shoot and charge for the bearer's unit. Seems really quite nice on the Virtus Praetors, that one. They're likely to be throwing themselves towards the enemy, perhaps charging something and then consolidating into something else. If the opponent can't slay them on the counter attack, they're just the unit that you want to be able to fall back and shoot with and then charge again. It means that the Interceptor Lancers get the +1 to wound again, and you'd be able to utilise their decent enough shooting. Definitely looks like a handy one to have on a Virtus Praetor captain, and it also gives you a once per game movement shenanigan. If you're not within engagement range, then you get to make a reactive normal move of up to 6 inches. That could be enough to save you from an enemy charge, or perhaps even get your units out of line of sight. Next up, we've got Unstoppable Destroyer. This one gives you usually D3 mortal wound impact hits on the charge. You roll a dice and you get 3 on a 6 or none for a 1. Handy enough to cause a little bit of extra damage, I suppose. Maybe kind of equivalent to what the Veiled Blade gives you, given that that one's not guaranteed to inflict damage. And on top of that, you also get a once per game Battle Shock aura after the charges. Everyone within 6 inches has to take a test. Kind of limited-ish use in the charge phase. It's really just good for preventing your combat using combat interrupts or command point rerolls and things in combat. Seems okay if it's cheap, but I feel like it's maybe not going to change the world on the character, just doing a tiny bit more impact damage. Lastly, the final one is Inspirational Exemplar. This one's an anti-battle shock one, giving your lead unit a 5+ leadership, and a once per game cancel battle shock ability. Definitely doesn't hurt, but I feel like it's a little bit on the situational side. It's not like units still can't fail battle shock on leadership 5, and the cancel battle shock can often be done the same job with the 1 command point Insane Bravery. Not for the enemy debuff style things, but perhaps the depleted unit battle shock is the most dangerous as it happens at the start of your turn. Feels a little bit underwhelming to me, though I suppose not too bad if you've got a really big critical unit. Just a little bit of extra insurance that battle shock isn't going to ruin their plans. Overall, I do feel like literally all of these are usable. On first impressions, I feel like my favourite ones might be the first 2. Veiled Blade just for extra attacks, and that objective control thing could be handy once every so often. And Ceaseless Hunter does look rather good on Virtus Praetors. Falling back, shooting and charge is kind of what they want to do, and the reactive movement is quite a fun shenanigan as well, and could potentially save a valuable unit's life. Overall, seems like the shield host looks like a fairly strong detachment. The 4+ feel no pain is kind of handy, though probably not quite as important as Martial Qatar. The stratagems seem amazing, particularly resurrecting custodians and auto-interrupt on objectives before the enemy gets to fight. Both of those are massive, and the enhancements seem usable, maybe a tiny bit less standouts, but all pretty decent. Stands the custodians in good stead in my opinion. Moving on, we've got the custodian datasheets. Battle line units here are the custodian guard and the prosecutors, basically the same as the troops were last time round. I guess we'll have to wait to see for the Forge World Index whether or not the Sagittarium custodians are battle line or not. Hopefully they will be, as I know at least a fair few players have a decent amount of them. In general though, I feel like custodians aren't usually going to struggle to fill their points cost with the units available. All the units are very chunky and dangerous. Otherwise, for main datasheet changes, there are a couple of ones that have gone. Both of the Vexillas, the standard one and the Terminator one, they've been rolled into the main unit, so I guess we've lost 2 elite character datasheets there that might have been useful for bearing those enhancements. It means that the Custodian Guard won't get any more of their auras of durability buffs at long range. The Contemptor Dreadnought is still here, at least the one with the multi-melter and the assault cannon, despite the Horus Heresy era one apparently going to Legends, and otherwise there have been a few interesting tweaks to squad numbers. Really quite a few of them got shifted either up or down. Custodian Guard come in minimums of 4 now, and Terminators in minimums of 2, but the Virtus Praetors have also been dropped to a minimum of 2. I think all of these changes represent the Vexillas being rolled into the squads, and also the Jetbike Captain from the Dawn Eagle box. The same seems to have happened for the Sisters of Silence now. You can field very many units of those if you want to, at units of 4. As mentioned, the Forge World datasheets aren't here. They'll be in their own Imperial Armor Index, hopefully not too far behind this in 10th edition. Custodians do kind of rely on them for a more well-rounded army. I kind of wonder whether that Mystery Horus Heresy release might be a big plastic Custodians release. I feel like that would be really quite a nice move. Custodians definitely feel like half an army at the moment, and having a bunch of the Heresy era stuff brought into nice shiny plastic for regular 40k, that could be good fun. Otherwise, there's really quite a lot of common army rules that are common to quite a few datasheets. In general, Custodians got a bit tougher. They're toughness 6 with a 2+ save and their 4+ invul rolled in now. No innate protection against mortal wounds, but at least in this index you get the 4+ save against mortals from their detachment rule. The Custodians' leadership is 6, so basically the same as Space Marines now. Games Workshop does seem to be committing to making Battle Shock really relevant against everyone. Still though, I wouldn't have been terribly surprised if the Custodians had been leadership 5, given that they are really quite the Emperor and are sort of above all the rest of the Space Marines. Otherwise, their base objective control is 2, even for their troops units like the Custodian Guard. You can get to objective control 3 with a Vexilla though, which might be kind of necessary. Objective control 2 just might not be a huge amount of units for the Custodians, and they don't have old-style heroic intervention stratagems anymore to protect objectives and step up with their Guardian Spears. Most Custodian infantry can deep strike now. You can have the majority of your army in reserve if you really wanted to. I think it might be kind of limited use, given that you're usually going to be making 9-inch charges for them. Rapid Ingress is a very powerful stratagem though, could certainly be one powerful way to get a key Custodes unit to the front. Games Workshop have also gifted the Custodian units in general with 2 different unit abilities, rather than just one like quite a lot of other armies in the game. I guess again to further differentiate the different flavours of Big Golden Boy with Guardian Spear. I suppose that does help set them above some of the other units and mark them out as true elites. And finally, the Sisters of Silence anti-psychic abilities perhaps have been reined in a little. They've got a 3+ feel no pain against psychic attacks now, but no defense against mortal wounds, and they don't have any sort of aura that messes with psychic abilities or anything like that. So against quite a lot of psychic powers and librarians and things, they're not really going to interfere with what they do. They're just going to be a bit tougher against some of their attacks and better at killing them for the most part. Overall, quite a few major shake-ups to the army, I think. Army-wide Deep Strike is interesting, though maybe a little bit less aggressive on objectives with their objective control and counters too. A little bit more shaky on the morale side of things as well. Getting into the datasheets proper, and first up we have the Custodian Guard. 4 to 10 models in the unit now, so you can't take a minimum squad size of 3 anymore. I think that's going to represent the Vexilla no longer being an independent character that you can field separately. It does mean that the squad's been changed to be a bit of a bigger investment unit. Might be interesting with the 2-man Terminators and 3-man Wardens, but they might be a bit easier if you want minimum size disruptive Custodian units. It is kind of notable that you can field all the way up to 10 of them though. That could be massively efficient in terms of character leadership buffs and any stratagems as well. Could be a really good target for that. Stats wise, they've gained the +1 toughness, Only Leadership 6 Plus and Objective Control 2 without OBSEC both feel a bit toned down. I perhaps wouldn't have been too surprised if these guys had got Objective Control 3, given that they were basically the old troops, but you can get that with a Vexilla, I suppose, even if it's no different to the Wardens or the Terminators. Weapons-wise, the trusty Custodian Guardian Spear I still think is looking very good. It's Strength 7, AP-2 and Damage 2 in melee, losing a bit of AP there, but at least on the Custodian Guard they've gained significant amount of attacks, getting 5 of them rather than 3 with it. That's really quite brutal, generally going to be a buff to their damage output overall, particularly with the choices of the Martial Qatar. At range it fires out 2 shots to 24 inches, Strength 4, AP-1 and Damage 2, and it's got the Assault keyword as well, which is really quite nice. It means that you can close with the enemy really quite quickly and actually still keep up your hail of fire at full accuracy. The other loadout is their Sentinel Blade and Presidium Shield. The shield gives you a 4 wound profile rather than 3. It doesn't give you any extra buff to your saves now though. The Sentinel Blade though really does trade out quite a lot against the Guardian Spear now. Previously it was damage 2, but now it's dropped down to damage 1, and that's just going to make them a lot less of a scary unit, even if they might be a little bit tankier. Could perhaps still be worth having 1 shield in the unit. If you got shot by damage 3 weapons, it could be the first unit to take those hits and make the unit a bit more tough against them. The Misericordias throughout the Custodes army do appear to no longer grant extra attacks, I'm afraid. You're not going to get your bonus little dagger attack on every model. It looks like they're only relevant for models that neither have the Guardian Spear or the Sentinel Blade. As say, for example, you can have the Vexilla in the unit, and that can take a Presidium Shield, so you'd attack with the Misericordia instead. Realistically, I think that could be a bit nicer just to give them the Guardian Spear, really. Talking of which, as mentioned, the Vexilla is just a squad upgrade now, gives them Objective Control 3, which I think is important, but unfortunately doesn't give them any -1 to hit or cover anymore. Definitely a small blow to Custodian durability as they move up the board. Finally, for abilities, like the rest of the infantry, they gain Deep Strike. Definitely interesting that that's not just the role of the Terminators anymore. And for their 2 unique abilities, once per game they can double shoot. Really quite nice to get a decent amount of anti-horde going with all of those Guardian Spear shots. They'll definitely pack a surprise punch with damage 2 there. Finally, their damage buff is they get to reroll wound rolls of 1 against everything, but they also get full wound rerolls against models on objectives. That's really quite a brutal damage boost, particularly with the Guardian Spears in combat. That Strength 7 profile absolutely loves rerolls to wound. Overall, of course, they might have raised the points for them a bit, but I feel like broadly the Custodian Guard just feel like a vastly improved unit. Strong melee and shooting, massive damage buffs within the unit itself, double shooting spears, and even a bit of improved toughness to boot. I think in general I'd be a lot more tempted to field the Guardian Spears over the shields from this first look. For the other flavour of on-foot Custodians, we've got the Wardens. It seems that their thing, rather than being a bit more aggressive like the Custodian Guard, is to be a bit more tanky. These guys can be fielded in squads of 3 to 6, so don't get the same sort of squad changes as the Custodian Guard, and you can't field massive units of them anymore. Their stat line and the Guardian Spear profiles are basically the same as the standard Custodian Guard. They don't get a built-in feel no pain anymore, and they don't get an extra attack. What they do get though is a change in special rules and the option to take the Castellan Axes. The Axes finally got damage 3, which a lot of people have been hoping for them for quite a long time now, but unfortunately Games Workshop hasn't really been very kind to them. They have fewer attacks, hit worse, and are also worse AP. And despite being strength 9, between those 3 debuffs, it still just makes them a flat worse weapon really. I think they only really pull ahead against things like toughness 8 and 9 multi-wound things, or 3 wound infantry with fairly bad saves. Pretty disappointing, but I'd say at the moment it's Guardian Spears all the way for me. Otherwise, for their abilities, again they gained Deep Strike, and their special rules both revolve around durability. They get a -1 to wound for strength 6 plus weapons if their unit has a character in it. It basically means that if you're fielding these guys, you absolutely need to put a character in, whether it's a Blade Champion, Shield Captain, or Mr. Valoris. That really is a very nice durability boost. It's going to help them out against the weapons that are best at killing them. In general, your opponent is usually best off firing anti-tank guns at the Custodes. As if that weren't enough durability, once per game they can just casually double their durability. A 4+ feel no pain type save for a single phase, definitely worth using if you just know that your opponent's going to light them up with a whole load of damage, or has just charged them with an enormous close combat unit. You do have to be on the ball for this one though, has to be declared at the start of the phase, rather than reactively to enemy attacks. Overall seems pretty solid. Looks like the Custodian Wardens are the tougher ones and the Custodian Guard are the aggressive ones. Both look pretty interesting to be honest. Seem like strong merits to both of them if they are the same points. I guess we'll have to wait for points cost to weigh them up properly though. Otherwise, for Custodes Infantry, we've got the Alaris Custodians. These guys have had their squad size shifted a bit. Previously, you could take them in individual ones when you could field the Vexilla as a single character from the box, Now you can only take them in 2 to 6 models. It means that you do actually have to invest in the unit somewhat, and you can't just field lone disruptive custodians to drop in the enemy lines. Even with 2 of them though, it still seems likely that they're probably one of the cheapest custodian units that you can field, not having to pay either for 3 wardens or 4 guard. For their stat line, like a few Terminators, they lost an inch of movement, down to just movement 5, but they did gain toughness 7 for their trouble, and that means that small arms are really going to find a lot less purchase on them. Really quite a big bump that's going all the way up from toughness 5. Weapons wise, they get the same axes and guardian spears as the rest of the units, and like the wardens and the custodian guard, they just get the same amount of attacks as them. They aren't any better in melee, bar their special rule Slayer of Tyrants. These guys also pack that ballistas grenade launcher as well to get a bunch of anti-infantry shooting. These ones fire out d6 shots at strength 4, AP-1 and damage 1. Worse strength than AP, but more shots, and they also gains the 10th edition blast keyword as well. In general, that's far better than in 9th, and these will be kind of savage against big hordes with 20 models in. Otherwise, for special rules, I think they've got 2 very interesting ones, to be honest. Slayer of Tyrants means that they're just great at killing big stuff. Each time your unit makes an attack that targets a character, monster, or vehicle unit, you get to re-roll the wound roll. And it does appear that that's both range and melee attacks as well, so it could actually have your Guardian Spears and your grenade launchers punching up a bit. The inclusion of character units in that means that that's relevant against really quite a lot of bodyguard units. I feel like these guys are just going to be enormously efficient, good at killing the big stuff. They should generally be pretty good at killing little stuff just by their raw stats alone. Against monsters and vehicles, you could also combine it with a +1 to wound stratagem, and then it would make more sense to use sustained hits over lethal. Could be seriously deadly against vehicles with that little combo going on. Finally, once per game they get a teleport move if they're not within engagement range. The From Golden Light rule is triggered at the end of the opponent's turn. If they're not within engagement, then you get to remove them from the board, and they come back via Deep Strike at the end of your movement phase. In theory, if your opponent goes first, that could be a first turn charge threat there, which is kind of fun. But in any case, just being able to redeploy around the board late game could be kind of interesting too. Start them up the board and slog towards the enemy, and then if they're out of position for any reason, they could jump around and maybe threaten the opponent's backfield or something. Overall, looks really quite interesting. Custodian Guard are just generally dangerous, the Wardens are generally durable, and these Custodians seem like they're specialists in just dealing mass damage to the heaviest hitting enemies around. They also do have a decent amount of anti-horde shooting as well. I feel like having different rules in the army could be pretty interesting. You could maybe emphasize or de-emphasize certain squads depending on the opponent. Finally, for the more frontline custodian units in plastic, we have the Virtus Praetors. 2 to 6 models in the squad now, so you can just field small units of them. And that I think is really quite an interesting option given they're such big pricey bikes. I think quite a low investment to buy in is really quite a good thing for them, and it's quite nice for people who have the box as well, as it means that you can build 2 of these and a shield captain, and then not be left with 2 useless bikes if you wanted to run the shield captain on the jet bike. In general, the stat lines for these guys have just been all around nerfed though. It doesn't mean that they're necessarily any weaker in 10th edition than they were in 9th, their points cost might well have just gone down proportionately. But unlike the Custodian Guard, Wardens and Terminators, which I think you could argue got stronger, these guys do seem to have been toned down. For their stat line, they're a little bit slower at movement 12 inches, and the fly keyword with mounted models isn't anywhere near as powerful. They can't just hop straight over terrain and instead need to measure diagonally. They also lost a wound as well, so there are only 4 wounds, not 5. Definitely easier to kill for damage 2 weapons there. And unlike the other models, they didn't gain any toughness, remaining at toughness 6, which is still kind of good against small arms, I suppose. Otherwise, both of their ranged weapons are significantly worse than they were before. The salvo launchers were high AP and damage D3 plus 3, now they're only damage 3 and they've got lower AP. Seems that if you want anti-tank Custodes shots at range, you either need it for the Contemptor Dreadnought or the Land Raider. The infantry and bikers aren't going to be doing anything for you there. The Hurricane Bolters also lost power as well. They've halved their shots down to 3 and 6, their range went down to just 18 inches, and while they gained twin links to re-roll the wound roll, that will math out to still being flat worse against every single target. The biggest damage cut will be against hordes, which they were already wounding kind of well. The Interceptor Lance is a kind of similar profile, and still gets the +1 to wound via the Lance keyword now. That one's been shifted around, and they've gained +1 attack, though have lost their bonus Misericordia attack. Overall, I feel like with the rest of the nerfs, they're going to be a bit more focused on being a combat Lancer unit, as opposed to fire support or being particularly tough. Finally, I would also say that both of their special rules are a little bit on the underwhelming side. They auto-advance 6 inches, which is kind of fine, but also means that they won't be able to shoot and charge, which basically means it's very rarely going to be a good idea to do so. Unfortunately, their second rule also keys off advancing as well. The Quicksilver execution means that if you fly over an enemy unit, you roll a dice for each biker in the unit, and on a 2+ you deal out 2 mortal wounds to the target that you moved over. This would be pretty great if you could do it from a normal move and you didn't have to advance to do so, but seeing as you do have to advance, again you're giving up on shooting and charging with them for that. And the charge profile with the Interceptor Lancers is highly likely to do more than 2 wounds worth of damage, so you have basically just traded out and lost damage output by doing this. Could be nice enough though if I guess you just want a reliable way to execute one enemy character with a very high invul. Sometimes damage out of normal phases can be handy. Still though, broadly speaking, bad news profile wise I'd say. Again though, if they have gone down in points by a fair bit, it could still be absolutely fine for them. In terms of raw stats though, with all the other datasheet changes, they don't feel quite as far ahead on the other datasheets just in terms of raw damage. Custodes vehicles next, and in the core codex choices limited, just the Venerable Contemptor and the Venerable Land Raider. The Contemptor I think looks pretty interesting. Compared with the more standard one, I'd say it is a little bit easier to kill than it was before. Seems that most Dreadnoughts have gone up to a 2+ save now to compensate them for the -1 damage, but the Venerable Contemptor sort of loses out a bit on that way, as it already had a 2+ save, and it's also lost its Feel No Pain going here. It is still Toughness 9 with 10 wounds and a 2+ save with a 5+ invul though, so it's not exactly doing terrible on the durability front. It has also lost a little bit of movement as well, which I think will hurt it. Only 6-inch move now. It does mean that it will be struggling to catch what it needs to in melee. Weapons wise, it's got the choice of the Keres Pattern Assault Cannon, which has 6 shots, strength 7, AP -1, and devastating wounds. The Venerable Dreadnought still hits on a 2. And then it's got the choice of the Multi-Melter, which is still pretty fearsome against tanks, but has been limited to 18-inch range. The close combat weapon only punches on an AP -2, but is otherwise still fairly solid. In general, broadly it's been a big tone down for the Venerable Contemptor compared with previously. Again, might be reflected in points though I suppose. What really does seem to have improved for this thing is its unyielding ancient rule, which I think is a very nice special rule indeed. This one special rule is that when it gets killed for the first turn, you roll a dice and on a 2+, it just stands back up again with d6 wounds remaining at the end of the phase. I think you could certainly argue that that probably outweighs losing the other durability rules there. You're effectively getting an extra 3 or so wounds of Dreadnought on average from that roll, but far more powerfully than that, it means that your opponent usually just can't shoot it dead in a single shooting phase. Say if he's across the board, shoots the thing, then it's just going to stand back up, and they won't be able to fire any more guns at it, as that's the end of the phase there. Could be nasty if they have to kill it in combat as well. They charge it, kill it, it stands back up, and goes on to deal damage in your turn. Overall looks kind of fun. I'd say probably the biggest issue for it though is the slow movement. The Venerable Land Raider I think has come out of the 10th edition changes rather well. It'll generally quite like the idea of vehicles and shooting out of melee. That was always a big problem for Land Raiders historically, and otherwise it's broadly had the same sort of changes to other Land Raiders in the game. Toughness 12, improved las cannons with d6+1 damage, twin-linked heavy bolters out the front, and all of its guns hit on a 2+ still, as it's crewed by Custodes presumably. It's got a transport capacity of 6, and it doesn't specify anything else besides Custodian Infantry, so that could be 6 Terminators if you wanted to deliver them that way. And of course the very biggest thing for Land Raiders in 10th edition is that glorious assault ramp. Move the Land Raider 10 inches, get the squad out 3 inches in front of it, make a charge at an average of 7 inches or so, an average of 20 inches of threat range for melee delivery. Obviously it will be a big tax to actually get that sort of charge off, but it is seriously intimidating. Again, like the Venerable Contemptor Dreadnought though, it does look like it lost its Feel No Pain type save, though it does have the smoke keyword, and that'll be kind of nice for the powerful 10th edition stratagem, cover +/-1 to hit for 1 CP. Definitely looks about 1,000,000 times more interesting than the 9th edition version. Whether or not it remains the best thing will be something else to see, but actually having a transport that can genuinely deliver combat troops to combat is a bit of a turn up for the books. Next up, let's talk through Custodes characters. We'll start with the generic character options and then move on to their epic heroes, Trajan Valoris and Valerian. After that, we'll look at the Sisters of Silence. First up for the characters, we have the on-foot shield captain, maybe a bit of a rare sight in competitive Custodes armies recently, but given the new character attachment rules, I think he's going to be coming back in really quite a big way. The standard shield captain can either lead Custodian Guard or Custodian Wardens, and while his personal stat line is okay, I think the main focus is his special rules. Just for himself though, he gained toughness 6, lost a wound, the shield gives him that wound back, and he's got the similar sort of changes to the other war gear. The Guardian Spear attacks that he gets are 7 attacks at strength 7, AP 2 and damage 2, and I'm pretty sure that'll be the way to go for him. For his special rules though, he looks pretty excellent leading Custodian Guard or Wardens, as when they get into combat you get the extra Qatar stance each fight phase. So you could have both sustained and lethal hits on 6s if you wanted, or you could have one of the above and a -1 to hit for when your opponent hits you back. Really quite a serious combat boost there, though I guess the second one that you pick will always be less effective than the first, as you'll pick the best one first. For the most important combat of the game though, you can just literally have a phase where you have all three. Really quite nice to have both damage buffs active, and also the -1 too. Otherwise though, he gets the Space Marine Captain style buff for Stratagems, which I think is truly excellent. A 0 CP Stratagem to target your unit once per battle round, and you can only use one unit of this rule per turn, even if you have a bunch of captains. With the sheer power of the Custodian Stratagems, this seems truly excellent to me. You could use it on the 2 command point ones, the -1 damage, or the fights first, both of which are great, and if neither of those are super important, you could just get extra +1 to wound against vehicles, or even just hailing a slain custodian if you can. You can also double up on stratagem usage with this. It means that you could spend 1 command point to resurrect the custodian somewhere in your army, and 0 CP to resurrect one in his squad. I feel like that's going to be a bit of a blow to your opponent if you're potentially getting 2 custodians back per turn. Overall, I think between those rules he looks like a pretty excellent leader for the squad, plus as a generic character he can bear your choice of enhancements as well, and a few of those are pretty good too. There's also his equivalent for the Alaris Custodians as well, really quite similar but toughness 7, a grenade launcher and an extra wound. Again he gets the 0 CP stratagem thing. I feel like you probably want a copy of that somewhere, it's more of a choice of which Custodians unit you put it on. Otherwise, his second special rule is basically fights on death for a 2+ for him only, and only if he's not already fought in that combat. I'd say that's really quite a lot worse than the squad buff that you get from the generic shield captain. It kind of relies on things having gone terribly for the squad already, and this guy getting killed, and also not getall killed at range. Overall, just for his raw value, I think it's a fair bit less useful than the shield captain on foot. I guess the main question though is whether or not you want that free stratagem on the Terminator unit or one of the on-foot custodian units. It means that it could still be very good value if it's Terminators that you want to build around. Finally for the captains we have the Dawn Eagle one. He's got the Virtus Praetor stat line, and kind of gets similar sort of changes to what the Praetor unit got. 1 less wound, a lower movement, and the Lance didn't gain attacks unlike the squad. Again, he has the 0 CP stratagem thing, though I would say that some of the stratagems are locked to infantry units, or just a bit less relevant, seeing as they already get a +1 to wound, so they won't need that one against monsters, and sadly he can't respawn bikes, that would probably be a bit too much. Besides that though, he also adds a 6-inch consolidate to the unit, would definitely be handy for destroying one thing and consolidating into another, and once per game you get some serious movement shenanigans at the end of the fight phase, either fall back at the end of the fight phase and maybe try and get your bikers a bit safer for next turn maybe, or just make a normal move at the end of the fight phase if you happen to have killed the unit that you just attacked. That could be quite nice for objectives, or just keeping your squad a bit safer to strike again next turn. Could be kind of interesting to strike the enemy unit, move, shoot them and assault them, kill the unit in combat, and then beetle off 12 inches away from the enemy to hopefully keep them a bit safer. Overall definitely looks really quite interesting in terms of movement shenanigans for the custodian bikers that he's using. Like the other captains, he doesn't really give them any innate damage boost though I still think has really quite a lot of value between those movement shenanigans and the free strats. Overall I'd say that one captain in the army is basically auto-include for the free stratagem, others have diminishing returns as you've already got one to farm out those CP. Finally, for the generic Custodians characters, we've got the Blade Champion. He can lead the on-foot Custodians in Custodian Guard and Custodian Wardens, and statline wise he's now gained himself a 2+ save. Previously he was the only model in the army that had a 3+ save, as he had the same style of armour as the Jump Pack Custodians from Forge World. The Vault Swords keep the same sort of profiles that they had before, one for anti-character, one for anti-infantry, and one for anti-elites or heavies, all pretty scary and pretty decent at the things that they want to kill. The anti-character one gains precision and is strength 7 damage 2. The anti-infantry one gets 9 attacks at strength 5 and damage 1. And the anti-elites one is fairly punchy, only 5 attacks but strength 6, damage 3 and AP 3. And it also has devastating wounds as well, so every time you look out with a 6 it will be felt quite big. Could be kind of nice for that Blades relic, particularly on the last profile. Otherwise he also gives his unit a 0 CP heroic intervention. Could be kind of nice for his unit protecting another squad nearby, so your opponent can't just charge one and pick apart the army. He gets to reroll advance and charge rolls, so a bit more likely to deliver his unit into combat, and once per game he's got a very nice advance and charge for your unit. Potentially his squad could be going really quite an enormous distance on foot, just between the advance and charge, and then rerolling both results as well. In theory I think that's an average 19-inch charge, which is really not bad at all for an on-foot infantry squad. Pretty terrifying to have custodians bearing down on you at that speed, and they could even potentially double shoot some Guardian Spears on the way in. Overall, again, looks really quite nice. I feel like it could be interesting to have a unit with him in, and then a unit with a captain in. They do quite different things, but both seem to have really quite powerful buffs to the unit that they're leading. Custodian special characters next, and next we have the big man himself, Trajan Valoris. He can only lead the Custodian Guard and the Wardens now. Looks like he can't run with the Terminators. Overall, Trajan is still looking rather good, I think. He's still a very tanky model just in his own right. He's lost a wound, though he's gained toughness 6, and has retained his 4+ invul and a 5+ feel no pain. Not going to be easy to remove without dedicated anti-tank fire and a fair bit of it. His shooting's buffed a fair bit, going to strength 5, AP 2 and damage 3. He's got at least a reasonable chance to kill a Terminator in the shooting phase, which is kind of cool. Though his melee was reined in just a little bit, he can't re-roll his hit roll anymore, and he's lost AP on his attacks, and while he's still strength 10 and damage 3, he won't be wounding all vehicles on a 3+ anymore. His main permanent special rule for leading the unit is that he protects his squad against modifiers. He can't have any of the characteristics modified for his squad anymore, so I guess they're not going to be -1 to hit or wound or anything like that. Really quite nice reliable defense, but I feel like it is kind of dependent on your opponent. Some opponents just aren't really going to try and modify your characteristics, they're just going to try and shoot you dead with guns or charge you in melee. Finally, he's still got his Moment Shackle, and as before, it still has a very meaningful effect in combat. You trigger it at the start of the fight phase, and he can either choose to double his attacks, he no longer needs to survive to the end of the phase for that, so he can just go into ultimate rage mode with 12 attacks at damage 3 there. That seems pretty terrifying on top of things like Martial Qatar. If it looks like he's going to get killed by the enemy before he gets to strike, you could maybe trigger his 2+ invul save instead. With his profile, I think that basically means that he's near guaranteed to survive this fight phase, and makes him a super great target for further command point rerolls as well, if he did happen to fail against a big important hit. Otherwise, he's also a different place that you could gain the Fights First rule. As mentioned with the Stratagem, it's a massive deal in 10th edition. Your opponent charges you, and then you just hit them before they get to hit you. Really quite big when he's leading an entire unit, and unlike that Stratagem, it neither costs CP, nor requires you to be on an objective. Overall, I feel like he's still going to be a pretty intimidating leader. Certainly looks like it's going to give you a big pause if you're trying to kill his squad in close combat with that Moment Shackle. I'd say besides his raw stats though, he perhaps adds just a little bit less than some of the other shield captains. The free Stratagem and the Martial Qatar buff for the standard 1 on foot look excellent value, and I'd guess that they'll probably cost a fair few points less than Mr. Valoris. Will be interesting to see where people decide to go in terms of characters to join their units. Finally, for the main Custodian characters, we have Valerian of Valerian and Alea. He can join either Custodian Guard or Custodian Wardens, and for the most part his profiles had similar sort of tweaks to Custodian Captains. In combat he does punch a bit harder than some of them. He's got a relic Guardian Spear called Gnosis, and that one gives you Strength 8 and AP 3, both of which are quite nice, and he also gets 1 extra shot at range as well for what it's worth. He swapped his Transhuman Physiology type rule for a Feel No Pain type save of 6+, a little bit of extra survivability there. And then in terms of what he adds to your unit, he gives your unit a durability buff in melee by worsening the AP of enemy attacks by 1. And then 2 kind of interesting special rules to manipulate dice throws, re-rolling either a hit, wound or save once per battle round, and also once per battle can just change 1 dice to an automatic 6. Could be nice enough for something like a key wound roll, or maybe a key saving throw. Overall though, I feel like the melee debuff is just a little bit on the situational side. You might be fighting against an entirely ranged army, or just one with so much AP that doesn't matter. I can't help but think that he's going to be really quite a hard sell, at least compared with the other shield captains. Overall, I feel like maybe the more on-foot models, the standard shield captain, Mr. Valoris and the Blade Champion, look perhaps some of the most interesting just on their raw stats and abilities. The specialist shield captains I feel like are best used just if you want free stratagems in either Terminators or Bikers maybe. Compared with the rest though, I feel like Valerian looks kind of underwhelming. Finally, and beyond the Custodes, we also have the other Talon of the Emperor, the Sisters of Silence, 3 sister units, their Anathemas Icon Rhino, and Alea and the Knight Centura to lead them into war. As mentioned earlier, they have had a few key changes. Their minimum squad size seemed to be 4 now, so if you wanted a very cheap unit to sit around on objectives, the Prosecutors could do that for you. They are objective control 2 as well, which is kind of nice, equal to a standard Custodian in terms of scoring, which is kind of crazy. Obviously nowhere near as hard to kill though. Otherwise, I feel like the Sisters of Silence have maybe lost out a bit in their psychic debuffs. Previously they'd make psychic powers harder to cast, and I feel like that mechanic worked kind of well for them, could actually genuinely be a problem for psychers, and even tank damage for things like smites that had to hit the closest units. Now though, their anti-psyker rules are basically represented by having a 3+ feel no pain against psychic attacks, which is kind of okay, but you could just send those psychic attacks elsewhere. You don't have to target the closest unit anymore. They don't really have any way to mess with more buffing psychic powers or abilities, so enemies are going to use their buffs and debuffs with impunity. They do have a bit of boosted damage against Psychers though. They've got precision and devastating wounds versus Psyker units. Nice enough, but with standard bolters, they're not really going to do all that much against most characters. They'd be relying on fishing for sixes. Maybe might be enough to snipe something like an Eldar Warlock maybe, with not too many wounds. Otherwise, I did notice that they lost a little bit of movement as well, down from movement 7 to movement 6. Overall still interesting as a unit. With only 4 models, I can't help but think they're going to cost quite a small amount of points. I think they are going to be very relevant to the Custodian's army, as they can just basically hold points or screen areas of the board from deep strike, and just do other slightly grunt work tasks like that you don't really want to be entrusting to massive great expensive golden boys. Besides them, we've got the 2 different variants of the Sisters of Silence, the Vigilators in melee and the Witch Seekers with their Burning Flamers. Again, the Vigilators have the option of the smaller squad size, due to being able to build the Knight Centura out of the same kit. Losing the movement might be kind of relevant for them as they want to get into combat, and their Executioner Great Blades have seen a bit of a side grade, only AP -2 now, but they did gain both Devastating Wounds and Anti-Psyker 4+, maybe not a too bad all-round melee profile. Their other special rule is that they've got something called Deft Parry, a -1 to hit in combat, though I don't think it's usually really going to save them with a Toughness 3 profile and a 3+ save. Just quite a lot easier to kill than the Custodians, and most anti-infantry units will not have too much trouble in picking these up. Maybe it could be interesting jumping out of a Rhino, or perhaps just if you wanted a Sisters of Silence unit that's still going to be fairly cheap and actually have some good countercharge threats. Thirdly, we've got the Witch Seekers, again quite an interesting unit for the Custodes as they retained their Scout 6-inch move, really quite handy to have a bit of mid-board presence and screen back the enemy if relevant. They could confer that to an Anathema Psychana Rhino if they wanted. Their Flamers have seen a bit of a downgrade though, they're no longer Assault and they lost AP. They do ignore cover as well, but that's only going to be a bit of a side grade at best compared with losing AP. Still though, a decent amount of auto hits on the enemy, and they could be a lot more relevant in 10th edition due to the Overwatch stratagem and barbecue some light troops trying to get close to them. Their special rule is that they can hand out a little bit of battle shock in the shooting phase. Might be kind of helpful if you do manage to debuff an enemy unit, but overall I think that they could still be really quite an interesting unit for the Custodian army, get a little bit of mid-board threat on objectives early, and they could be really quite a fun unit for overwatching objectives, put them within threat range of one, and then dare the enemy to get close unless they want their squad barbecued. Quite nice to be able to field them in very small units as well. In general, scouting units that are really quite cheap tend to be quite efficient. To transport the Sisters around, there's the option for the Anathema Psychana Rhino, kind of similar to other Rhinos, having gone up to transport capacity 12, toughness 9, and a bit of auto healing in the command phase. Unlike the Space Marine version, this one doesn't have any sort of firing deck, so you can't fire flamers out of it sadly. The new transport rules could be interesting enough for getting those flamers in range if you did want a squad of those. Scout up 6 inches, and then in your turn move 12 inches, disembark the squad 3. That should be quite a lot of threat range on those anti-infantry weapons, which should barbecue some light infantry quite nicely. The Rhino also gets the 3+ save against psychic attacks as well for what it's worth. Occasionally could make it surprisingly durable if your opponent's got a lot of that. Not sure how much it would really be worth the investment though. Maybe depends on the points cost for just how cheap the Vigilators and the Witch Seekers are. Next up, we've got the Sisters of Silence leader, the Knight Centura. She can lead any of the 3 flavours of them, and also take each one of the weapons. She gets a slightly boosted Great Blade with 3 attacks that hit on 2s. She grants her units a +2 to move, advance and charge, probably most relevant for the Vigilators, as they lack the charge buff as well. Means that they could actually have a fairly scary threat range, though of course they're still going to be very fragile when the opponent hits them back. She also gives the unit scouts 6 inches as well. Again, perhaps seems most relevant on the Vigilators, seeing as the Witch Seekers already have it, and maybe doubles down on the melee utility by giving the enemy unit desperate escape if the enemy falls back. They get a -1 to the check if they're battle shocked. I feel like whether or not she's going to be good or not kind of depends on whether or not Vigilators are good. I feel like they might be a bit of a tough sell in an army that's got so much AP -2 damage to melee going around, but I guess it could be a potentially interesting option if they can scout forward in a Rhino and then get really quite a long charge with her movement buffs, potentially jumping out and charging turn 1 even. Finally, for the Custodes army, we've got Alea. She's the special character Knight Centura and can lead either Prosecutors, Vigilators, or Witch Seekers. Compared with the Knight Centura, she gets a much boosted melee profile, strength 6 and damage 3 and 4 attacks with Somnus. Definitely makes the squad that she joins a fair bit more punchy in melee. Again, looks like she'd be best on the Vigilators, to be honest, given that she makes the squad fight first. That would actually make them a fairly intimidating prospect to charge, rather than usually something that you can be pretty sure that you'll sweep off the board with a bunch of anti-infantry hits. Again, she's got Scout 6 inches, and grants a damage buff to her squad when her unit's damaged, a +1 to hit if you've taken casualties, and also a +1 to wound if you're below half strength. Again, that of the Knight Centura probably seems best in a Rhino with Vigilators. Overall, I feel like the Sisters of Silence might not actually be as amazing for their intended battlefield role. In terms of actually killing Psychers, it looks like the Vigilators are the best there, getting anti-Psyker and devastating wounds. Kind of a shame that they won't really interfere with psychic buffs or anything now, but I still feel like a couple of the units seem really quite useful. Prosecutors for holding objectives, likely to be nice and cheap at only 4 model units, and Witch Seekers seem kind of fun getting Scout for the army, jumping out into the midfield, and then maybe being a rapid response anti-infantry unit. Putting it all together, I feel like it's not too bad a time for the Adeptus Custodes on the whole. The eventual points cost will tell us just how strong the army is compared with the rest of the competition, but until then it looks like quite a lot of the units are usable, and there's some interesting combos with the shield captains, and particularly free stratagems with the various powerful ones that you have for the shield host. I really quite like the standard Custodian Guard and the Terminators in particular. Lots of massive damage there on models that are kind of hard to kill. The Custodian Guard and Wardens have got some very good leaders in Trajan Valoris, the Blade Champion, and the standard Shield Captain, and there's more interesting ways than ever to get them into combat now between things like Land Raiders and Deep Strike plus Rapid Ingress. The big long charge from the Blade Champion looks also quite good fun. Otherwise, I think quite a lot of the power does come from those stratagems, particularly regenerating Custodians. I think we're going to see quite a lot of that. The Sisters of Silence also look like they had a little bit of utility, probably in a bit more of a niche role with supporting the Custodians, rather than being any sort of main event in the damage dealing game though. In any case, look forward to hearing your thoughts as to how the Custodes army is going to be put together. What are you most looking forward to putting on the table in 10th edition? If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. We'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, with new ones out just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and that's the main reason that I can continue to make 40k videos like this quite as often as I do. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.